Greetings, this is Griff Ruby with another Isaac Asimov short story review. This one now appears for the first time on the pages of Analog Science Fiction, which of course is what Astounding Science Fiction became over the course of 1960, with kind of first the word analog appearing very ghostly over Astounding Science Fiction, and as the year progressed, we got the word analog got stronger and stronger, while astounding kind of faded and faded and faded. And finally, the other thing was it started turning into a fact fiction rather than just fiction. Still kept the same acronym ASF for Astounding Science Fiction, only now it's Analog Science Fact. So kind of kept the same letter, analog. I wonder what they would have done in these days when computers are now digital. But in those days, analog, computers were analog. A lot of them were. The slide rule, for example, or something I saw just a few days ago that was kind of intriguing. It was like this sort of a plate that almost looked like a circuit board, but it was actually a hydraulic plate with all these different entry points for pressure to indicate how fast the engine is turning, how much torque is being used, how fast the car is going, and so on and so forth. And it would actually mechanically compute from all of this what gear, an automatic transmission should shift to. And it was like it's an analog computer is what it is. So kind of a cool idea. And there was a lot of those analog computers and ordinary practical day-to-day. Or they have these science kits where you have these little dial thing, and you could it kind of does the same thing slide rule does, but it does it electronically. But it's still purely analog. It's not ones and zeros. It's not digital. But anyway, this is the new scientific direction, and John Campbell himself is taking this direction. And now this introduces what story this is. It's listed as a special feature here, and it's called Thiotimoline and the Space Age. Isaac Asimov, page 155. Now, Thiotimoline, if you've been following these series of stories, you will have to kind of realize, wait a minute, I haven't given any other Thiotimoline entries at all. And there's a reason for this, and I might as well just talk it right now. The reason being that the Thiotimoline articles, especially the first two, were truly written up like just purely scientific articles. This is done. The laboratory found this. This experiment was done. These are the results. Tabs, tabulations, drawings, whatever, of the graphs and so forth like that, charts. And what you had was no story at all. I mean, these are, if anything, kind of dry runs for what would somewhat later on go on to become a major part of his writing, which is to say fact instead of fiction. Except these are still fictional. You take a fictional idea, in this particular case, a chemical that dissolves so fast it actually dissolves in water or whatever solvent you're using even before the solvent, the water, whatever, is even introduced. It already begins dissolving. And by how much time and how quickly and how thoroughly and how evenly and all these different things come to be discussed and studied over the course of this thing. So it first appeared in a much older issue of Astounding Science Fiction, namely that of March 1948. And it appeared, as I said, the endocrinic properties of the sublimated Thiotimoline by Isaac Asimov, on page 120. Well, there it is. It also came with a little blurb. An article on the remarkable chemical substance. This one seems to have escaped from the JACS. Journal of something, I'm sure of it, but at any rate. And it has this. It had the text of the study, and he had to try to write in this turgid, unfree flowing. I mean, normally he tries to write so that the reader can look at this and this is great stuff. Now it comes from the time he's trying to write his PhD thesis, in chemistry, and he's doing a topic on something kind of similar, only it's a real chemical that dissolves, different ways and so forth. And So how he's kind of getting a dry run at practicing at writing the very turgid, unfriendly style. Long, complicated titles. The androchronic properties of resublimated Thiotimoline. And this was the kind of names that research papers had in his day. So he's trying to come up with all of that, and it has tables. There's one. And it has graphs. Look, there's 43 of them on this next page. 1, 2, and 3. It also comes with another table, and another chart, and then it even ends with a list of some 8 or 9 references here. So, and they gathered this all up into the early Asimov, where he also tells a little bit of the story about how this original story came out. But I think I've given you enough that you can see more of it in the early Asimov. Together with all the charts and tables, graphs, whatever, they're all reproduced in here quite faithfully. In fact, going through that and the original release in here, the only difference I could find was the way the references themselves are treated. They are not given footnote numbers on here where they're given, but they still seem to be in order. There are little footnote numbers, like you see one here. I don't know what finger is. That's a tiny one. It's hard to see. There's another one here above my finger again. There's a little 3. These are actual pointers to the first and third, and in fact everything up through the first 7 of these listed items are actually identified. So the first one, P. Crum and L. Eskin, Journal of Chemical Solubilities. Sounds nice and dignified. Concerning the anomalous solubility of Thiotimoline. Okay, there's a second listing. And there's a third one, again, P. Crum and L. Eshkin and O'Neill, Structure of Thiotimoline, Parts 1 and 2. You see, and so on, and all the way down to, like I said, there's even it goes as far as footnote number 7. I'm not going to try to find it now. But it all kind of, in subject matter, you can tell it's actually corresponding to what these references are obviously about, judging from their titles. Except there's 2 more at the end that don't seem to be footnoted. And they look kind of Thiotimoline, ispitated, market short, anyway, some other language. I don't know. Maybe it's supposed to be transliteration from like some Russian or something. I don't know. It's kind of exotic stuff. An interesting sub-motif that will come out much later on. So you could see all these quotes. Well, when they gathered this up into the early Asimov, instead of putting numbers on there, they did the opposite. He did the opposite. He took all the little footnote numbers out, except number 6. I'm sure that's an accidental oversight, which is in the same place and still refers, apparently to the 6th listed reference there. So, I don't know. I guess he decided footnote numbers don't really matter. I mean, it's a joke article, so, but he had taken it that one small additional level. I mean, he took the bother to include the references. He should point to them. Well, that was funny, and it had a lot of amusement and entertainment factor to it. He would revisit this stuff again, however, in the December 1953 edition. This time's December 1953. So, and in this case, it would still be just a purely scientific type article, this time specifically listed as a special feature, the mycopsychiatric applications of Thiotimoline, 107. And he's talking about how you can use, how determined are you to add water to this thing? It actually seems to be able to measure that. Okay. So, again, no picture here. Just have a squib. Asimov's original double talk item on Thiotimoline started Astounding Special Feature series. This item was originally delivered as an entertainment item to a chemical club. Well, not exactly. It has a couple of drawings. One here kind of illustrating the difference between the way you would represent a carbon atom and its valence, like when you're drawing a molecule on paper, you see you have a carbon atom, you have a bond going in, 1, 2, 3, 4, like like a square direction around it. But as we know, a carbon atom and its bonds is actually more like tetrahedral in configuration. So it's having the idea of what if you manage to twist it, as it were, pivoted on the axis of time, if you will, and get two of those four atoms out of our plane of time. Like one atom's in the future and one's in the past, while the other two are still rooted in the present. And if you had some molecule that could twist it to make it do that way, see, that's, I guess, the idea of how Thiotimoline would work. More interesting, it has this whole device here that you would use for how to purify your Thiotimoline. Really good here. And this is a fairly detailed description of what this works and how it's meant to work and so forth. It has another little chart. Apparently, you could determine how determined somebody is to add the water. And it can vary among different students, and you get a bell curve here, but you get a slightly different bell curve among, of all things, the female students. Turns out, I guess, they're a little more determined than these guys. They're kind of more, I don't know, easily distracted. I don't know. That's okay, whatever. It's just whatever. Here's a couple of tables. And in this case, what these tables are referring to is using this to examine schizophrenics who, the idea being they got a split mind, it's doing two different things, and amazingly the Thiotimoline will dissolve unequally. And to varying degrees or with varying rapidity, which is the second table is just the greater, but there's a very slight difference to the most significant differences measurable. But how these are supposed to correlate to any other aspect of schizophrenia was never made clear, and I don't know, it seems like a topic for further study, I suppose. So, and it too, without any footnoting along the way, I noticed, but it still lists a number of references, and they do seem to be kind of discussed in the order that they're, more or less. So, the first one of these references is of particular interest. It's referencing something, even though it's not footnoted. Maybe it is. You know what? I think they are. Only they use parentheses around the numbers instead of little raised numbers. So let's see here. Some years ago, the unusual endochronic properties of purified Thiotimoline were first reported in this journal, number 1. So what is this journal? And I love this. This is the name of the journal is the Asimov I, the endochronic properties of the sublimated Thiotimoline, and then it says Journal of Astounding Science Fiction. Makes it sound more like a serious scientific journal than just Astounding Science Fiction. The Journal of Astounding Science Fiction. Oh, it even gives the correct page numbers. 50. Well, I don't know. It'd be interesting to see. Is this issue number 50? Probably is, I bet. L, yeah. L, number 1, yeah. Okay. So, I mean, it has all of that, exactly as if it were in the scientific study. Well, I did not include these because there's no story there at all. And even what's included in this one barely qualifies as a story. I would put it as being roughly on par with the one we had a ways back about pâté foie gras, the one about a goose that lays golden eggs, and they're making these investigations and concluding that there's some kind of nuclear reaction going on inside this goose's liver. Just make for some interesting foie gras. I don't know if I dare eat it if they prepared any. But at any rate, so this is kind of the same thing. Only here, what's happening is shades of like psychic discoveries behind the Iron Curtain, a 1971 book some folks may remember, where there were all these things going on behind the Iron Curtain. But what we found out is scientifically, it's kind of, there's a big obsession with that stuff around that time. But as time went on, it seemed like the more you dug into it, the less you found, and the more careful your scientific methods the less you found. So, um, but at any rate, this one, Thiotimoline and the Space Age. Again, there is a picture associated with it. I'll get to that in a moment. Let me read the blurb. It is some years since we had heard first of the fabulous properties of a sublimated Thiotimoline. Dr. Asimov now brings the subject up to date, showing its potential for the space age. Surely Thiotimoline is just what rocketeers driven nuts by the unreliability of their beasts need. Because what it talks about is if Thiotimoline can predict what water will hit it before, but only up to a small fraction of a second. But if you have another one of these, you have a little machine that detects if something's dissolved, it will then pour water into the next. And if that one's detected that water is in there, it will pour water into the next. And you have this whole series, a battery, if you will, which is just a lot of like all objects lined together, not battery like you stick in a flashlight, of these things, where you'd have this long series of something that could basically detect at one end that somebody did or did not put water at the other end, sometime tomorrow. So it kind of gives you a further glimpse further into the future. And it suggests that the Soviets are already making these things and using them. Here's some of the things involved in discovering some of this power. Inside that box there, which this guy is hacking open with an axe, or about to in the midst of there's a tornado, but the idea is a big, vast flood, a storm, all this stuff, and water gets in that way. Trying to cut it open so that the water would still hit it. Like fulfilling a prophecy kind of a thing. So there's our actual illustration. Notice it is not a chart, a graph, a table, any of the things you've seen here. And there is kind of some story about that. You hear about the stories of trying to fool it and what happens. And you can't fool it. It knows what's actually going to happen as a hard fact. So the idea being that the Soviets are using this thing in predicting the success of their launches. Very simple. If the man makes it into space successfully, he then radios, I made it appear, I'm in orbit, I'm safe, I've made it. And they put the water on the first thing and all the way on down till the day before it detects that, yes, water was put on the first one, which was put on the second, and all the way down to this one. So that way they will know before the launch whether it succeeds. And if it doesn't happen, then something's not going to succeed, and they just cancel it. And they, figure out what might have gone wrong until they get it all fixed up. And the idea is that this would be why it is, you don't hear of any Russian failures. The idea that maybe they don't tell us till afterwards is kind of not really raised. One rather odd detail about that, almost kind of spooky in a way, is it makes you think of the first launch was very famous. Yuri Gagarin goes up, does his one orbit around the Earth, and comes down. He could have come up, told them, yep, I'm in orbit, and they turned the thing on, and they know before he was launched that he'd make it up into space. But the second launch, they could have done the same thing with Titov in there, because he too successfully and peacefully made it into orbit. Unfortunately, it couldn't tell us that he would not successfully make it back down to Earth. And some of us may remember seeing those pictures of what was left of him after his spacecraft burned up and crashed into the ground somewhere in Russia. And what's left of him is, no. Anyway, but there's just enough of a story here that's kind of it, saying maybe we should get more involved in this kind of thing. But it's all meant as a joke, obviously. So now this one, unlike most stories, is once again collected in a rather unusual place, and that would be Isaac Asimov's Opus 100, where it appears on page 175. And as far as I can tell, it doesn't seem to have any changes. It even has there's a little intro inside the story. It says, transcript of a speech delivered at the 12th annual meeting of the American Chronochemical Society. And I think that's what it said here. Let me double check. Transcript of the speech delivered at the 12th annual meeting of there it is. Gentlemen, blah, blah, blah. And he tells the story. And he is telling the story like he's somebody that was involved in this research and these different things that happened, including the point where Somebody ends up taking an axe to cut open that box so that the flood waters of the rain or the storm, whatever, will meet the right place to trigger. It sees the storm and it triggers as if that's why it fed up with water instead of some more intended reason. So, at any rate, it's kind of a bit of a story, and you can, like I said, you can see why I didn't cover the other ones because there's no story there at all. This is minimal, but I've treat it as having crossed the threshold enough that I can now at last bring this all up. And Thiotimoline becomes a story. There will be one more installment of Thiotimoline, and what's kind of fun is that this gets collected. After John Campbell died, a lot of his friends, including Asimov and writers and people associated with him, gathered together a volume of, I think, newly written stories, maybe some new, some old. I have to take a look at the volume itself and comment on that when I can hopefully get a chance to do that. And apparently, the volume is, it's a collection of more astounding science fiction type stories and not analog. It's recalling that time of when we worked with John Campbell. We remember when, and how it was in those early days when, Asimov was writing Foundation installments and all his other early stories, and learning, and sometimes making mistakes fairly frequently in writing not so great stories in the beginning, and so forth, many of which had to turn up in other magazines for a while. Then after a while, you could get them all in Astounding, and then different things happen, but it kind of gathers all of that up. So it's kind of a volume of this sort of stuff. And for that volume, he writes a fourth installment. So that kind of goes back to our initial issue, analog science fact fiction versus astounding science fiction, which is really just the same magazine. And yeah, it was John Campbell's idea to go from one to the other, even as he had much earlier on, after newly becoming its editor, changed his title from simply Astounding Stories to Astounding Science Fiction. So, there you are. Anyway, that's our story, and I'm sticking to it. Thanks for listening.